Chicago, Illinois. Lisa and Chancellor Martin, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Susan. And thank you, Chancellor Martin, so much for being here with us. Really appreciate it. I am sure that a lot of the alumni have had a chance to hear you over the last few years, maybe virtually.
I
But
sort of felt like I've been sitting in a box for the last 2 years. Not been able to see anybody, so it's good to be here.
well, thank you so much. And we'd love to get to know you a little bit better and hear a little bit more about your vision for the university. So with that, tell us a little bit about your background and maybe a little bit about your trip away from St. Louis and back, and why you wanted to leave WashU.
Sure. So I grew up in Indiana. I sort of joke I'm the first Hoosier chancellor of Washington University. The St. Louisans will get that as a joke. Those who don't live in St. Louis, I can explain it later. But I grew up in Indiana. I went to college at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and I studied mathematics and government. Late in my time in graduate school, I was meeting with a mentor of mine from my hometown, who was a dean at Purdue University. And he said, Andrew, have you ever heard of this thing called political methodology? It's a quantitative study of politics. And the answer was no, I'd not learned anything about that. He's like, this is your thing. It's your two majors, but one. And he said, look, the three best places in the country to study political methodology: Rochester, Caltech, and WashU. So I applied to those places for graduate school. I visited St. Louis. It must have been in March of 1994. And I fell in love with the university. I fell in love with the people here, and with the community. So I canceled my trip to Pasadena, accepted the offer. I didn't get into Rochester, for the record. And I came here for graduate school. And so I've been at Washington University since 1994, when I arrived here as a graduate student and lived in a studio apartment at 6188 McPherson. It's right over there on Skinker. And I finished my PhD. I got my first faculty position at Stony Brook University in New York, and I taught there for 2 years. I'll say that, moving my wife from Seattle to Long Island was a bit of culture shock. So too was it for a Hoosier to live in Suffolk County on Long Island. And so in about 18 months after I was appointed at Stony Brook, I got a call from Lee Epstein, who was chair of the political science department at the time, wanting to know if I was interested in perhaps coming back to rebuild both the graduate and undergraduate methods curriculum in the political science department at WashU. And I said, sure, why not? Love WashU, love St. Louis. It was my wife's first time living in St. Louis when we moved back in 2000, but I was here for 14 years on the faculty, had leadership roles both in arts and sciences and at the law school. It was a wonderful environment for me as an educator, and as a scholar, and as an aspiring academic leader. Ultimately, in 2014, it was.
So how long had you been here?
14 years, from 2000 to 2014. My daughter at the time, I guess, was 6. And I was ready to take the next step in my leadership journey. And it was clear that there wasn't going to be opportunities at WashU in the near term. And I didn't want to sit on my hands for 5 or 10 years to wait. I thought I was ready. And so I was recruited to go to the University of Michigan to lead one of the largest arts and sciences colleges in the country. It's actually larger than the Danforth campus in terms of budget, students, physical plant. And it was a wonderful place, not only to be, but also to learn a lot about academic leadership. And so in my 4th year as dean, I remember I was actually in one of my cabinet meetings, and my colleague from across the table sent me an email saying, you see that Mark Wrighton is retiring. I'm like, that's interesting.
He was trying to get rid of you?
I think, to be honest, this particular colleague absolutely was trying to get rid of me. She's no longer at the University of Michigan. So I decided to throw my hat in the ring. And the opportunity to come back to St. Louis, to serve a university where I really grew up in so many different ways, and to be part of the renaissance of St. Louis, which really began, I would say, 15 or 20 years ago. And we are not there yet. We have a lot of work to do, but there's lots of opportunity. And so not only to come back to serve this university and help the positive momentum that we've had really for the last 175 years, and also at the same time help knit this university even tighter to the community here in St. Louis, and to be an important part of the renaissance that needs to take place here. I couldn't ask for a better job. If I had not gotten this job, I'd still be a dean at the University of Michigan, finishing my term, trying to figure out what to do next. I wasn't on the market. This is why I wasn't, it was in a sense premature for me to leave the position that I was in. I left a lot of unfinished business. But the opportunity to come home to WashU was an opportunity I couldn't pass up.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I'm envisioning that as you were going through that process and you were getting interviewed, nobody said like, so how will you handle a pandemic? So I'm sure that you've had your share of challenges over the last few years, but how would you describe your first 3 years as chancellor?
It's a tough question. In many ways, it has been invigorating, inspiring, energizing. Having come back to St. Louis, my family and I moved back right around Thanksgiving of 2018. So we've been in town now, not quite 4 years. And at the same time, this massive challenge thrown on our plate, just about a year after. I assumed responsibility for leading the university. And so at the time, incredibly complicated. Some of my trustees joke, they're like, well, can't you just pull down the new Chancellor handbook and turn to the pandemic chapter? I said, one, there is no new pandemic handbook, and two, that chapter doesn't exist. And so incredibly complicated and difficult time for the first 6 months of the pandemic. In that time, the leadership team of this university pulled together in extraordinary ways, and that's true on both of our campuses. I was frankly more involved in what was happening with regard to clinical care at the medical school, where I was meeting with the department chairs daily for about 3 months, as we had to potentially change the standard of care, and how are we going to stand up testing, and how are we going to get people in and out of the clinic? Who are the patients that we're going to force to defer? Is cancer surgery elective surgery or not? I mean, all of these different, very complicated questions. And at the same time, we very quickly had to ramp things down on this campus. And then a few months later, begin to figure out how we were going to reopen and what way we were going to be able to reopen. And so as I sit here, not on the other side of this ongoing pandemic, but as I sit here today, right, I couldn't be prouder of the people that I have the opportunity to work with and the people that I serve. The way this leadership team and our professional staff and faculty pulled together to continue our education, patient care, and research mission in this very complicated time, it's extraordinary. And I would argue that there's not a university that handled COVID better than Washington University. There's some reasons for that I can talk about if folks are interested. And as I sit here today, I'm like, wow, we have emerged as a stronger university because of this pandemic, right? The leadership team is stronger. The sense of community is stronger. The resilience our students, our faculty, and staff have shown leads us to believe that we're in a much, much stronger place. And in the midst of this pandemic, we completed the first comprehensive strategic plan that the university's had in over a decade.
So go ahead and talk a little bit about why you think WashU handled it better, and what were some of the tenets, because you were making decisions daily with limited information. So what were the? We were.
So the things that I think led us to handle the pandemic very well is that first, in February of 2020, we articulated a set of guiding principles that we used all the time. And I remember we had a board meeting. It would have been late February, early March. I mean, it was literally the week before we had to close the university. And I brought in one of our leading infectious disease doctors, who was an advisor throughout this entire process, to talk to the board. The first thing we talked to with regard to the board, here are the principles for decision-making. The top of the list is the health and safety of the community. And we were clear that that was not just the Washington University community, but that was the St. Louis community, right? And so a week later, when I told our students, don't come back from spring break, and if you do come back, you can't get your stuff, right? The reason why we did that is because our doctors told us that if we brought back our 5,000 to 6,000 students who were out of town, that St. Louis could have looked like Boston did when the healthcare system collapsed. And so we began with a set of principles, and we used those principles relentlessly with regard to everything that we did, and we were transparent about those principles. I wrote about them on our blog. We started meetings with them. That's how decision-making took place. The second thing that we did is that we were not arrogant enough to believe that the chancellor or the executive vice chancellor or the deans all were going to have the right solutions. So we stood up a process which began really in April of 2020 to plan for how we're going to operate the Danforth campus. Parallel process happening on the medical school with regard to clinical affairs. That's in partnership with BJC Healthcare with regard to research. Let's focus on the Danforth campus. How are we going to bring back undergraduate and graduate students back to this campus in a matter of months? That process was led by our interim provost, then passed on to Beverly Wendland, and she took the mantle of provost on July 1st of 2020. And we had over 200 people with expertise on every little project we had to work on, right? So how are we going to deal with air quality in our building? So we're going to rely on faculty from McKelvey Engineering, and we're going to work with folks from our facilities department. So we had 200 folks, faculty and staff, in a very well-organized structure to tackle every little problem. So it wasn't like this is the solution that's going to come from on high and everybody needs to fall in line. There was buy-in by this community that we were going to center the science. We're going to make the best decisions we could. Not everybody was going to be happy, but we're going to be transparent about that. And that process of leveraging all the expertise that we have. I mean, we have one of the best medical schools in the world. So why not have our infectious disease doctors at the table as we figure out what makes sense in terms of how we social distance in the classroom, what was acceptable or not in the dormitories and everything else. One of the decisions that came out of this process was for us to start the academic year much later, as late as we possibly could. And if you remember, if you had college-age children or whatnot, in the summer of 2020, universities were racing to open as quickly as possible. Why was that? Everybody's worried about Thanksgiving. And look, Thanksgiving is important. I enjoy Thanksgiving. But in the grander scheme of things, figuring out how to get kids back home for Thanksgiving was not the most important thing. We decided to wait and start the academic semester in mid-September. Thanksgiving be damned, right? And the reason for that, and then push exams past the holidays, so exams would take place in January, which was stressful for some of our students, and it was difficult. But the reason we made that decision was twofold. One, we had no idea what was going to happen. So when you have no idea what's going to happen, take as much time as possible to collect as much data as possible, right? We had a much better sense of how to operate, particularly students in classrooms, by mid-September of 2020. And we've started the first week of August of 2020, like Notre Dame did. We wouldn't have had as much information. Second, every other university in the country was starting earlier. Good for Washington University, right? We could use all the information about what worked and what didn't work from other universities. Our provost was talking to her peers from all of our similarly situated universities. I was talking to presidents and chancellors all around the country having the same conversations. And there were many things we did differently simply because other places tried things and they failed. So centering the science as our set of principles led us to a process where we made a very counterintuitive decision. Or maybe it wasn't, I actually found it completely intuitive. Maybe it's not counterintuitive. Maybe it's just, not the same decision that everybody else.
To a lot of the parents.
Maybe not the same decision that everybody else made, but one that actually served us very well.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, it's hard to think back to where our heads all were at this time and how quickly things and information were moving. But
yes.
So going back before those days, at your inauguration, you made a focus on in St. Louis for St. Louis, and you've lived in St. Louis most of your adult life. You were a fan of sports teams and cultural institutions, and so talk to us about, and you did a little bit in your entry about why and how WashU can benefit St. Louis, and also why you think that's good for the university long term.
Yeah. You think about it, you look, think back to all of the Fortune 500 companies that have left St. Louis over the last 10, 25, 50, 100 years, right? Those are large, important institutions that for business reasons chose to leave this market. Washington University is one of the only enduring institutions in this city that will never leave, can't leave. And our charter won't allow us to leave. It would be immoral for us to leave, right? And so that relationship between Washington University and St. Louis is so important. So when I interviewed for the job, it was the last interview. It was on a Friday morning. I got the call the next day, Saturday morning, when I was at my daughter's softball game or baseball game. I laid out a vision for the way in which the university, through our mission, can help make St. Louis a better place, right? We do three things, right? We educate folks, right? And so how can we think about opening our doors to a Washington University education to more people? A lot of the work around student access is helping in that domain, but we've also revisioned University College to open our educational doors to more regular folks in St. Louis to help them on their job, on their careers, right? We do research. Not all of that research has anything to do with St. Louis. My research, absolutely nothing to do with St. Louis. But there are so many parts of this university across all 7 schools where the research that we do serves this community and can help make this community a better place. And then finally, we're the healthcare provider of last resort here in St. Louis. And how wonderful it is that we spend hundreds of millions of dollars of our own money to take care of patients who wouldn't otherwise be cared for. And those patients get to see the finest physicians in the world. Now, why did I make this commitment? Well, the commitment is pretty straightforward. And it gets back to that last interview. So I'd come back to St. Louis. I had a dinner on Thursday night with a whole group of trustees, including Larry, Jerry, and Gary, all at the same table, which was very confusing. But I sat next to Bill Danforth at that dinner. And then the next day was the interview, my interview. And before I left for the airport, Bill sort of did this. And he said, Andrew, I want you to remember one thing. If St. Louis goes, so goes Washington University, right? The fortunes of this university are inextricably tied to the fortunes of this city. Now, things have changed a lot in St. Louis since the summer of 2018 when I came and interviewed for that job. I'd say for the first time in at least a generation, we have the business community and the nonprofit community all pulling in the same direction. The direction that we're pulling is with regard to equitable economic growth and a reinvestment in the core of our city. And we have done some amazing things. We had all of these different Chamber of Commerce business development type organizations. We blew them all up. I was in all the meetings when we voted ourselves out of existence to form Greater St. Louis, Inc., to be able to present this region to the world with one voice, not lots of voices. And so being at the table with business leaders here in St. Louis, as we work together to do things has been really fun. And we've gotten lots of wins. Attracting lots of new jobs coming back to St. Louis. Some of that attraction is because of the university, because of synergies with our biomedical and life science research capacity, with a lot of the cybersecurity work that's happening down at the McKelvey School. It's really been great.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, was some of this in the works, or how much did WashU instigate the formation of these things?
No, much of this had been in the works, but I think what had been in the works had been frustration. Lots of folks sitting around the table with a really dour perspective on what was happening in the region, and had really, in a sense, resigned themselves to the fact that this wasn't a tractable problem. From my perspective, that wasn't a satisfactory answer. Right? Because if the answer to the question is we're never going to be able to drive economic growth in St. Louis, this is going to be a dying city over the next generation or two, we're screwed as a university.
You're going back to Michigan.
And so we had to, but I think that was the sense of the community. This started before I arrived. Beginning in 2016, 2017, there were a small group of individuals. Washington University was at that table, and their first move was to pull together a patient capital real estate fund. Universities invested in that fund, and that fund is all about making catalytic investments to help develop from the Arch to the Park. And so it's called Arch to Park is this fund. Now it's part of Greater St. Louis, Inc. That was the first move. That led to the creator of Greater St. Louis Inc., the bringing together of all of these entities. The business community has stepped up in a financial way much bigger than before. It was actually really easy to say no to all of the chambers when there were so many of them. You just say, I can't do this, can't do that. Well, now when you have a single ask, it's really helpful. And then we've had some extraordinary philanthropic support from the community, particularly the Taylor family, which has deep connections to Washington University. Andy was on the board up until just a year or two ago to give us the financial fuel to be able to drive on some things. And we've got some big wins and some little wins, right? We had a big NASCAR race here last weekend, which is a big deal for St. Louis. Big deal for St. Louis. A week and a half ago, we started our first nonstop flight to Europe on Lufthansa, which we haven't had since TWA left.
Wow.
And again, you know, these are small wins. We need to keep going, but things are moving in the right direction.
That's great. So speaking of wins, this is a big win. The growth in the endowment
Yes.
made national news. Dramatic growth in our endowment. But along with that great news came some misperceptions about rich universities. So talk a little bit about how we use the endowment to propel and maybe address some of those misperceptions you've heard about.
Right. So I got to throw the facts on the table just because I have to. You know, our endowment was up 65.1% last fiscal year. We added over $6 billion to our balance sheet in a single year. And it's the largest one-year return of a private university endowment we've been able to discover, at least for the last 40 years. I mean, maybe there was some, many, many years ago. And we were able to do some really extraordinary things. One thing we were able to do was reallocate $1 billion of that endowment for student support. That's functionally the same thing as getting $1 billion philanthropic gift to support financial aid for our students. And we were able to do that ourselves and make that investment with an initiative called Gateway to Success that the board approved and we were able to announce in October. So what is that endowment used for? Well, I think the conspiracy theorists out there think that there's a big pile of money that sits in my office and I sit there and count it or something. It turns out what the endowment is for is to spend. That endowment produces, right, on a $15 billion corpus, is going to roughly spin out $550–600 million of revenue every year. What do we spend that money on? First thing that we spend, the largest line item we spend money on is student support. Full stop, right? And that is allowing students to come to Washington University. And I'd like to talk about access at some point. So if somebody asks a question, that'd be great about what we're doing in that space and where we're going. But also making sure that our graduate programs and everything else are very well funded. Second thing that those endowments support are our faculty. Right? There's not a greater recognition a faculty member can get than be appointed to an endowed chair. The money that comes out of that endowed chair supports the faculty member, both their salary, not all their salary, but some of their salary, their benefits, and also supports them in their scholarly and educational pursuits. And then we have endowments that support research. You think about all of the amazing research that's happening on both campuses, and whether that's about air and water quality and McKelvey, whether that's about American political institutions in the Department of Political Science or Alzheimer's research at the medical school, that is expensive, right? And we raise hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in grant money from NIH and other places to help support that research. With endowments, that also allows that research to continue. In a sense, the way I think about it is that those endowments are actually being expended for the public good. The public good through our research mission, public good to opening the doors to this great private university to regular folks, regardless of their means, and to support the world-class faculty that make that research and education mission function. So that's what the endowment is used for, but the numbers are big, right? The numbers are big. At the same time, our endowment payout still represents a relatively small amount of our operating budget. This fiscal year, which closes at the end of the month, our operating budget was just over $4 billion. So $550 million is material, very material to that budget. But most of our revenue is still coming from patient care and from tuition.
Interesting. Yeah, I think people don't appreciate all the dynamics of the financial.
They just say it's a big old pile of money somewhere and they want a piece of it.
So since you opened the door a little bit to questions from the audience, I'm going to take a break from my questions. And I think we have staff people with microphones,
Yep,
Susan.
they're coming.
So if folks have some questions, we'll address those.
When you ask a question, if you could go ahead and say your name, perhaps where you're from, and the reunion you're celebrating. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, Brian Mayhew, 40th reunion. When I started here in 1978, in the process of 4 years, the tuition almost doubled. Okay, so when you say $1 billion, that does not impress me. Okay, so are you saying you reduced tuition for upcoming students from $65,000 a year to $60,000 a year, or did you reduce tuition from $65,000 a year to $40,000 a year? Or how are you really helping to make WashU affordable other than to those people who can afford to go here?
Sure. Well, so I did neither of those things. In fact, we continue to raise tuition every year at a rate lower than the rate of inflation, but we continue to raise tuition. But what we're doing is that we're spending money such that those folks who can't afford to come here can. Let me share the data. If you have a family income $75,000 or less, this is true for students from Missouri and Southern Illinois. It's actually true nationally. You can come to Washington University free of charge. No tuition, no room, no board, no books, anything. We cover it, right? If you have a family income between $75,000 and $200,000, remember, median family income in the United States, $56,000, right? So about 2/3 of the potential students who would come to Washington University could come for free. Okay? For that next set, $75,000 to $200,000, we still have work to do. We give very generous financial aid packages, not quite as generous as some of our, not as generous as some of our peers. But for our students in that tranche who graduate with debt, the average debt is less than $20,000 after graduation. So these stories you hear of students borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars to come to universities, and some of our peers are predatory in that way. We're not doing that at Washington University, and I would hope that within the next year or two, none of those students will have any debt burden when they graduate Washington University. That means their family has a calibrated amount, and that they invest in the education, and then the rest the university covers. And then finally, for folks who can afford to come here, we have extraordinary demand to come to Washington University, and there's no economic rationale why we should discount, right? In fact, we maybe should increase the things at a much higher rate because that demand is so high. But doing that allows us to invest in students who aren't able to afford to attend.
Lars.
I think it was yesterday's paper, the Times, had an article about Oklahoma and NCAA softball and how there's some pushback within NCAA to have women's athletics occurring on the competitive level in Oklahoma because of Oklahoma and reproductive rights and legislation restricting such. Missouri, some would argue, is no longer a bastion of liberal progressive thought. And
That is an understatement.
and in the future may becoming even a darker place. So as Washington University goes, as St. Louis goes, as Missouri is no longer perhaps seen by prospective students, by up and coming rising faculty members who want to live in dynamic environments, or crusty old faculty members who want to retire someplace in a few years. How is the university thinking of these changes in order to still be attractive? And just to kind of personalize it, I know my husband totally disagrees with this notion, but I think at some point we may devolve as a nation and have and hopefully this happens peacefully. But, we may have like nations be formed, at least within the realm of the possible, maybe. And in that case, so how do you remain an attractive place for folk like me to continue to be investing in if, Missouri would not be in a country that I would want to visit anymore?
So it's a great question. And actually in around the table, Greater St. Louis Inc., we spend a lot of time talking about this because it's not just affecting our ability to attract students and faculty and professional staff, but it's also affecting our employers to bring the same talent here. So how are we thinking about it? So one, it's very important for us to continue to articulate and live out our institutional values. Now, we're very clear about that on a number of different issues, and we're never going to walk away from that. That has presented us some challenges. There has been an attack on the university endowment in the Missouri legislature, tied up with abortion rights for the last 4 years. We were able to successfully stop that effort this year, but it remains challenging. And I worry about things like stem cell research, for example, where there was a huge debate here in Missouri 20 years ago that Bill Danforth and John McDonnell and others were able to lead a charge against that. Those bills are popping up again in Kansas and Oklahoma right now, and Nebraska, and that's worrisome for our research mission. So we have got to stay aligned with the broader community and push back and tell the legislature, look, this is not helpful. And St. Louis is the largest economic engine in the state of Missouri by far. There are folks aligned with the university who are working the political angle. We can't do politics because we're a nonprofit. We can talk politics, but politics is about money, and we can't do money to be involved and make sure that those values are well represented. I think the other thing, and I was having an interesting conversation, one of our new faculty colleagues who was installed as the Masters in Johnson Chair down at the Brown School about this, and he and his husband had just relocated to St. Louis with his partner's parents and with their children. And at dinner, we were talking about the skepticism of some students wanting to come and live in Missouri because of the political environment. Not so much here in St. Louis, particularly in the Central Corridor where the university is located, but in the state more broadly. And his response is, we need you to come to St. Louis. We need you to come and be part of this political process. Because if the answer is we're not going to engage, right, you're going to write off big chunks of the country. I don't know if that's a viable strategy or not, but that was why he was willing to pull up stakes and move his family into St. Louis to try to lead on some of these issues. It's an absolute headwind for us. I get a nasty gram every month or two from a prospective student. I'm a really wonderful student and you would be lucky to have me, but I'm not going to apply to your university for that reason or the other. And I'm okay, thanks for letting me know. But it is out there. And if you think about our peers, right? So what are the elite research universities? Very highly selective, very highly rated. What are those universities that are located in red states? It's Rice and it's Vanderbilt, right? That's about it, right? So that's something that we worry a lot about.
I would love to hear how it's going on campus with mental health, with all of the strife in the world around us, and students kind of showing up in a different way than I think they did 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more empowered with it. It's certainly a different set of ideals. They've already learned them in a lot of ways, whereas I feel like I came and learned those things here. So what is campus life like?
So there are two questions there. I'll answer the easy question first, and then I'll answer the hard question. The easy question has to do with campus life. So, I mean, campus life has been on a roller coaster over the last 2 years. But really, for the spring semester of this year, things felt just about like they were back to normal. I mean, we were back at our athletic events, and the theater was running, and the musical performances, and people were spending time together, in various nooks and crannies in our buildings, but also outdoors. This place really felt alive for the spring semester in ways that it really hadn't for the 4 semesters previously. And I can tell you that our students had a deep sense of gratitude for their ability to be back with one another in fellowship, doing all those smart and dumb things we all did when we were in college. And so student life is markedly better than it has been for a long time. I also think our students are very mindful and are being much more intentional as they think about how they curate their set of experiences, right? Work-life balance, if you want to call that, I'd rather call it work-life integration, is something our students are talking a lot about now, but they weren't talking about that so much in the past. It was like, stomp on the gas, let's get to work. If I burn out, I'll deal with it in the summertime. I think after this pandemic in particular, you're seeing the same dynamics in the labor market. I talked about this at my commencement address a couple of weeks ago, is that people are really beginning to rethink their role in the world and what they want to do, and our students are being intentional about that, and that's a really good thing. The hard question is about mental health. We are in the middle of an epidemic on American college campuses with mental health crises. This predates the pandemic. The secular trend begins 5 or 6 years ago. It's very stark, and it's across all different strata of universities. And we don't have a clear answer today for why that's happening. Is it social media, right? Is it the political environment? Is it the hyper-competitive nature of getting into colleges and universities like Washington University? We don't really know. But we have more and more students who are presenting when they arrive with serious mental health challenges that need to be managed, and then other students who are facing crises while they are here. So what we have done is that we've built a team to tackle this problem head on. The most important thing to keep in mind with regard to mental health, and our students don't like it when I say this, is that this is a community health issue, right? So there's lots of things that faculty are responsible for, and the administration is responsible for, the students themselves are responsible for, that we all need to work on together. But this is also a problem where we cannot just continue to hire therapists to do one-on-one therapy with every one of our students who wants to do so free of charge forever, right? That's just not sustainable. And so, we have continued to staff up our counseling staff. We are still in a bit of a gray area with regard to licensing, but we have been able to use telemedicine a lot, which actually makes it much more convenient for our students and makes it more efficient for our staff. That worked really well when students were all over the country and our staff were here. Now our students are here, but that's been helpful. We're continuing to layer on other resources. With the leadership of Ana Gonzalez, our new Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, we invested in a product called Timely Care. Timely Care is an online product where if you're a student, you'd like to speak with a counselor 24/7, you can press a button within 2 or 3 minutes. You'll have a virtual appointment, and then you can schedule without a counselor going forward. That was something that was very well received by our students. And has sort of added to that infrastructure to support those challenges. The final thing that I'll mention is that Ana Gonzalez has led a strategic planning process for student affairs. An important component of that is healthy excellence, how she talks about this work. We don't want to talk about mental health, it's about healthy excellence, and it transcends mental health as well. It's actually about keeping your body healthy and sleeping and all of those sorts of things. But as we think about all the student affairs programming that we're doing going forward, healthy excellence is going to be centered in that. The faculty has been deeply engaged in the process as well. so they understand the things that they can do that are helpful and less than helpful in terms of dealing with our students. And so our goal as we continue to move forward is to set the standard. Our physical facility, which now is down on the South 40, doesn't work for almost all of our students. It's great for our first and second year students. Doesn't work for our upper class students. It certainly doesn't work for our graduate and professional students. And so we're in the early stages of planning what the right health and wellness center for Washington University needs to be. The other thing with Dr. G's leadership for finals this spring, they were able to reshuffle the staff and everything else to make sure that any of our undergraduate students who wanted to see a counselor face-to-face or in a virtual appointment could do so for the last 2 or 3 weeks of the semester. Not sustainable for us to do that year round, right? It's all hands on deck, no vacation, people working, basically having 16-hour, not working 16-hour shifts, but the office was open 16 hours a day to be able to serve our students. We were able to see every one of those students who wanted to see a counselor during finals. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's a real challenge across higher education more generally.
Thank you, Chancellor, for the update. I think this has been super enlightening. I'm curious about, my name is Jeff Maltz. I'm here for my 30th reunion. I come from the Bay Area. And I really am intrigued by the work from home movement that's happening right now and just kind of how it's, I think, impacting life everywhere. And I'm just wondering how the university is approaching that. What's life here going to be like in 5 years, 10 years? I mean, I personally think it's going to have a pretty profound impact on everything. And even in terms of people being able to stay in St. Louis and, they don't have to move to Silicon Valley anymore. They can do it from here.
Right.
So curious your thoughts.
So I'll talk about the university, then I'll talk about the opportunity for St. Louis. So in terms of the university, much of what we do has to be done in an analog face-to-face way. Our students and our faculty, myself included, have experienced Zoom University. There's a place for that, and there's an economic model for that. That's not what we do at Washington University. So what we do in the classroom is going to stay in the classroom. Our student affairs team, who are working on residential life and everything else, that's what the Washington University experience is all about. You want to get a commodity education and do it on your couch, you can do that, but that's not why you're drawn here. Most of the research that we do, not all of it, but most of the research that we do is done in physical laboratories. It has to be done in physical laboratories. So, and then with regard to clinical care, we're embracing telemedicine to the greatest extent possible, particularly for our patients who live hundreds of miles from St. Louis. But there's lots of different areas of medicine where telemedicine doesn't buy you anything, right? The patients still need to come into the clinic, still have to perform surgeries and the like. So as I think about the university, the way that we have talked with our local managers, I mean, our folks that are down running different parts of the university, is a message of flexibility. Pre-pandemic, we had 19th century HR practices. You couldn't even take lunch at a different time. Like, it was very regimented. Your start of your day and your end of the day, and there was no flexibility. And what we've told business managers are, look, you need to adapt to the market in which you're employing people, and you need to be more flexible. We do have some jobs which have moved to fully remote, mostly having to do with medical billing and medical coding over at the medical school. But we do have some of those that have gone remote. Most of our offices have adopted a much more of a hybrid format, where people are in the office 2 or 3 days a week and they're working remotely 2 or 3 days a week. There's a couple lines in the sand, though, for me, and I guess my board doesn't like it, they can fire me. I don't believe we should be outsourcing jobs outside of St. Louis in order to save money. We could do that, right? But the fact is that we provide great jobs and great benefits that regular people in St. Louis can obtain. We're the second largest employer in the region, just behind BJC Healthcare, our healthcare partner. For us to start taking thousands of those jobs and shipping them off to other parts of the country to save a few bucks, I don't think it's acceptable. The other piece is that I don't think it's in the university's best interest to recruit a faculty or to recruit senior professional staff who aren't willing to be part of this community. Right? There will be our peers who differentiate. We're going to buy your research. We're going to buy your name. You can teach remotely and never live in the city, never set foot on the campus. And I just think that's a bridge too far for this university and how important community is to us. We talked just a minute about St. Louis. One of the things that we're seeing is because of our relatively cheap cost of living and the great cultural institutions here, there are lots of folks who are choosing to leave the Bay Area and New York and LA to come to St. Louis because of the ability to work remotely. And so for us, particularly with the Cortex Innovation District and a lot of the technology companies, both startup and mature, that we're attracting to St. Louis, that provides an ecosystem, provides a community. So it isn't crazy for a computer scientist, whether it's from McKelvey or from Illinois or Purdue, or for Stanford, to decide that they could relocate here and build family and life here and still remain employed, with companies on the coast. So it does present an opportunity for us. But there's other great inexpensive places to live, right? So St. Louis has to step up and define what's the differentiating feature. And I don't think we've probably done that crisply enough yet.
I think we have time to take one more question.
Hey there, Daniel Koff. I'm a class of 2006, so I'm celebrating my 15th reunion here.
Right.
I wanted to ask about collaboration at the universities and in a few different senses. So picking up on some of this talk about spatial issues and also interdisciplinary across departments and across schools. I came to the university because of the Hewlett program. I saw philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology become a major, and I wanted to study with Bob Hansman in architecture and figure out how to design for people. So I ended up working with Dean McLeod to create a special major in social design so I could do that. And he was also very generous in helping us start a housing cooperative off campus. 2 years ago, I came back and I helped the co-op move to a new space off campus with a private landlord because WashU was renovating all the old buildings. So the co-op is now kind of completely unaffiliated with the university, unfortunately. And I see a lot of new collaborative spaces kind of popping up around the school, but they seem to be kind of specific to those schools. I'm not sure how much they foster interdisciplinary learning.
I'm sorry, just in the interest of time.
Sure.
The question?
So the question is, what is WashU doing to foster interdisciplinary collaboration? Is the Hewlett program has that picked up any steam? And
So we're doing a ton. And in fact, the university's strategic plan, which will be, there's a version of it that's available on the web now, and the full plan and the beginning of the implementation plan will be released at the beginning of the fall semester, is all about interdisciplinary collaboration. And in fact, finding those areas within the academic domain, within the student affairs domain, and with regard to our community writ large, where we can work much better together. So that's really what that whole plan is about. One of the major changes that happened at this university with regard to the undergraduate program happened a couple of years before I arrived, but was really smart. We used to have all sorts of financial incentives that kept the undergraduate schools from cooperating. Every tuition dollar followed every student in every class. And so what did that mean? Well, you'd set up requirements so your students couldn't take classes in arts and sciences, and now it's the Sam Fox School. That changed, right? We now do a tuition allocation based on a formula, and we have programs, many of which transcend our school and college boundaries. The most significant one now is a program called Beyond Boundaries, where students apply to come to the university, not pick a school, have many interdisciplinary courses taught by faculty members that are appointed in multiple schools. There's a class called Morality and Markets, taught by an Olin School faculty member and a professor of English. And then sort of do that type of work. So we've curated an environment where not only we've sort of gotten rid of some of the institutional structures that have made interdisciplinary collaboration more difficult, but we're also providing resources in order to encourage that type of work. On the academic side, coming out of the strategic plan, we're going to be big investments in public health. We'll be launching a public health school at Washington University. That public health school will tap current expertise from the Brown School and McKelvey and Arts and Sciences and Sam Fox and the Law School and Olin and the Medical School. Right? Another area of focus, digital transformation. Right? The digital has changed everything that we do. Right? From the visual and performing arts and the humanities all the way to the quantitative social sciences, the practice of medicine. And so we'll be establishing an institute to support that work. And then, of course, one of the biggest challenges we face today has to do with the environment and sustainability. And so where we have great strength, and that is in environmental policy, that is in environmental law with the environmental law clinic we have at the law school, and with a lot of basic science we do around areas of biodiversity and air and water quality, are places where we're going to continue to invest. All of those areas are areas where we're tapping the expertise around the university to drive both research and education programs, which we think are real differentiators for us.
So I did want to give you wanted a question about student access and you didn't get it. So I'm going to give that to you. And I do want to say sort of explicitly, because we've sort of implied, but not been explicit. I mean, one of the really exciting things, which was a goal of yours from the start, was need blind admissions, which means we're reviewing and accepting students with absolutely no consideration of their ability to pay. So as part of that, though, what's happening now with student access and student success?
We have a lot more work to do. We were with this $1 billion investment. We were able to move to need blind admissions, which all it means is you don't look at your applicant's ability to pay. What it meant before is we were looking at the applicant's ability to pay, and we were admitting more students at a higher rate who could fully afford tuition than those who couldn't. This admission cycle, for the first time, we didn't do that. And what does that mean? It means two things. We have the highest academic quality we've ever seen in an undergraduate class who will be joining us in the fall. And it's the most diverse class we've ever seen on every dimension: socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, geographic diversity, or anything else. I think one thing that you all should be proud of with regard to your university. Back in 2014, we were on the front page of the New York Times as the least socioeconomic diverse university in the United States. We had less than 5% of our students, undergraduate students, who showed up who were Pell eligible. My predecessor, Mark Wrighton, Holden Thorpe, and his provost made a commitment that this university was going to move quickly. I don't think they had any idea how quickly we could move from 2014 to 2022. The numbers are not final yet. There's summer melt and there's a little bit of movement. It is likely the case that we will increase our percentage of Pell students 4 times in 8 years, to go from 5% Pell to 20% Pell in 8 years. That is expensive, right? It is expensive. And it's also the case that educating a diverse student body is more expensive than a homogeneous student body. Think about it. If every student we brought to the university went to an elite private high school or a super fancy suburban public high school, they all had the same science courses, they all had the same writing training and everything else, it's much easier to teach those students. Now we're taking students with even more talent, but have had less opportunity, who haven't had great science training, might not have had the opportunity to study a foreign language, didn't have laboratory science, right? So we've had to build a curriculum and a student support, comprehensive student support mechanism, not remedial. This is all about how do we take these students with great talent and make sure they can get to the same endpoint as our students who have come here with great privilege, right? And so we are focused like a laser not only on the program, what do we need to do to be best in class? It's why I hired Beverly Wendland to be our provost. It's why I hired Ana Gonzalez to be our vice chancellor for student affairs, both of whom, by the way, first generation college students, right? They know how to do this work. They've done this work at other campuses, and it's in the academic space and it's in the student affairs space. I'll also say, and I know Susan Cohen wants me to shut up, but I'm also going to say that our faculty are prepared to do this work. I was in some of the discussions on the faculty 15 and 20 years ago when we were wringing our hands about, gee, I don't know, I mean, we need to stay rigorous and it's very important. And if students fail and have to leave majors because they can't do the introductory courses, that's on them. That's not on. That conversation is no longer taking place on this campus. Our faculty has bought into the idea that we can only live up to our full potential and only be as excellent as possible if we're as inclusive as possible in terms of our curriculum and what we're able to do. Now, part of this is philanthropy, right? We've gotten great support from our alumni for many, many, many years to help with scholarship, for tuition, room and board, and other expenses. We've also received great philanthropy to help support our students. But as we've gone over time, we're investing more and more, and we need our alumni to come and invest alongside us. And so I expect with a high degree of probability that come fall, you'll be hearing a lot more about work that we have been doing in this domain and work that we're going to continue to do. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for spending this time. And we feel very fortunate that you were at the helm leading us. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to see you all. Glad you could be here.
I will add my thanks to Lisa. So thank you so much for interviewing Chancellor Martin and for you both being here. And thank you all for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you at other reunion events throughout the day. We're very excited that our barbecue will be outside on Tisch Park. So hopefully you'll have some time to explore our new east end of campus. And please enjoy your day and the rest of the evening as well.